In May 1945, Nazi Germany collapsed in a storm of fire, hunger, surrender, and disbelief. Cities were piles of broken stone, millions were fleeing westward, and the once feared Wehrmacht had ceased to exist as an organized force. But no organization felt the consequences of the defeat more dramatically than the Waffen-SS. Hitler's elite military formation, born from ideological fanaticism and expanded into a multinational fighting force of nearly 900,000 men. When Germany capitulated, the Allied powers did not view the Waffen-SS as ordinary soldiers. They saw them as the military arm of the SS, a structure responsible for terror, genocide, occupation brutality, and political repression. The uniform alone was enough to trigger suspicion. Even before the war ended, Allied intelligence already had lists, dossiers, and personal files marking SS personnel as high-priority targets for detention. On May 8, 1945, the day of surrender, tens of thousands of Waffen-SS soldiers attempted to escape westward to surrender to American or British forces. They believed that surrendering to the Soviets would mean torture, execution, or vanishing into the Gulag system. Many threw away their uniforms, burned documents, or disguised themselves as regular army troops. Entire SS divisions abandoned their insignia overnight, trying to blend into the chaos of collapsing lines. But it didn't always work. The Allies quickly established filtering camps, temporary holding areas where German POWs were interrogated, photographed, and classified. Anyone with suspected SS ties was separated and detained for further investigation. Tattoos, units, eyewitness accounts, and even photographs were used to identify former Waffen-SS personnel. For many of these men, the end of the war was not followed by peace, but by uncertainty. Interrogations were harsh, and food conditions in early camps were poor. In the Soviet zone, treatment was even more severe. Forced labor, disease, and starvation took thousands of lives. The Soviets saw the Waffen-SS as ideological warriors of Hitlerism and held them collectively responsible for atrocities on the Eastern Front. Meanwhile, the Nuremberg trials began, and the SS was declared a criminal organization in 1946. The declaration meant that simply being a member of the SS, including the Waffen-SS, was considered inherently criminal unless an individual could prove they were conscripted or not involved in atrocities. For the men in captivity, the burden of proof shifted to them. For the first time, the once powerful elite felt powerless. Their divisions were gone, their commanders were imprisoned or awaiting trial, and the ideology they had sworn loyalty to had evaporated overnight. Germany was no longer their homeland, but a defeated, divided land under Allied occupation. The war had ended, but for the Waffen-SS, the real battle was only beginning. The battle to survive the aftermath, to avoid prosecution, and eventually to reinvent themselves in a world that wanted nothing to do with them. When the war ended, the Allied powers faced a monumental task, determining the fate of hundreds of thousands of former Waffen-SS members. While some had left clear fingerprints of war crimes behind them, others were simply soldiers who had fought on the front lines. Sorting the guilty from the ordinary was not easy, and it often wasn't fair. The Nuremberg Declaration of the SS as a criminal organization set the legal tone. Anyone who had served in the Waffen-SS was presumed complicit unless proven otherwise. However, the reality on the ground was chaotic. Allied interrogators were overwhelmed with the sheer volume of prisoners. Many German soldiers lied about their units, while others tried to swap identities with fallen comrades. The Allies, despite good intentions, often made errors, releasing genuine war criminals while detaining low-ranking recruits who had never participated in crimes. In the British and American zones, conditions varied. Some POW camps provided acceptable living standards. Others were overcrowded, undersupplied, and harsh. The worst conditions, however, were in the Soviet camps. For the Soviets, the Waffen-SS embodied the ideological and military enemy that had slaughtered millions on the Eastern Front. As a result, SS prisoners were sent to punishing labor camps where mortality rates were high. Many never recovered. Yet surprisingly, by 1947 and 1948, the situation began to shift dramatically. A new global tension was emerging, the Cold War. As relations between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union deteriorated, priorities changed. The West began to see Germany not only as a defeated enemy, but as a future partner against Soviet expansion. This geopolitical shift had direct consequences for former Waffen-SS personnel. The Western Allies began to accelerate releases. Many prisoners were freed after only brief detentions. Some who had been flagged as potentially dangerous were reevaluated under more lenient standards. Low-ranking SS members were often categorized as misled youth or wartime volunteers rather than ideological criminals. At the same time, major war crimes trials continued. High-ranking Waffen-SS figures like Kurt Meyer, Sepp Dietrich, and others were tried and, in some cases, sentenced to death, though many of those sentences were later commuted. In several trials, defense lawyers argued that the Waffen-SS had functioned primarily as a combat force, distinct from the concentration camp system. While historians today firmly reject this claim, at the time it influenced certain legal decisions. Ironically, some former Waffen-SS members were later employed by Western intelligence agencies. Their frontline experience and knowledge of the Eastern Front were seen as valuable assets in the brewing conflict with the USSR. These men operated quietly, without public acknowledgement. By 1950, the majority of surviving Waffen-SS soldiers in Western captivity had been released. What awaited them, however, was not normal life, but a society filled with suspicion, hostility, and an unresolved question. What place, if any, did these men have in post-war Germany? Post-war Germany became a divided nation. Capitalist West Germany, FRG, and Communist East Germany, GDR. Both states faced the same problem: how to reintegrate millions of former soldiers, among them tens of thousands of Waffen-SS veterans. But the solutions, the policies, and the public attitudes differed greatly. In the early 1950s, West Germany struggled economically and politically. The country needed workers, stability, and national unity. Chancellor Konrad Adenauer understood that millions of men who had served in the Nazi military could not simply be cast aside. They were voters, fathers, and often the only providers for their families. The question wasn't whether they would be reintegrated, but how. Yet the Waffen-SS presented a unique challenge. As a criminal organization, its members were legally stigmatized. Many employers hesitated to hire former SS soldiers, fearing social backlash or political consequences. For years, these men lived quietly, avoiding any mention of their wartime past. A former SS sergeant working in a factory or a shop was unlikely to reveal his previous identity. Silence became the national norm. Politically, the issue became explosive. Should former Waffen-SS veterans receive pensions? Should they be legally considered equivalent to Wehrmacht veterans? Public opinion was deeply divided. Opposition parties accused the government of whitewashing Nazi history, while conservative groups argued that long-term stability required reconciliation with former soldiers, all former soldiers. It was in this environment that the controversial veterans organization Haig emerged in 1951. Founded by senior Waffen-SS officers, including Paul Hauser and Felix Steiner, Haig's mission was twofold: to secure social benefits for former SS soldiers and to reshape public understanding of the Waffen-SS. They portrayed the SS not as ideologically driven criminals, but as elite frontline fighters comparable to any other army. Haig lobbied politicians, published books, and organized public gatherings. Their influence grew rapidly during the 1950s. Many West German officials, eager for political support, softened their stance on former SS members. Some were reluctant to confront the past too aggressively, fearing it would destabilize the fragile young democracy. In East Germany, however, the narrative was starkly different. The GDR government portrayed former SS members as class enemies and Nazi remnants. Many were monitored, interrogated, or pressured into silence. While some were accepted into manual labor, others remained under quiet state surveillance for decades. By the late 1950s, former Waffen-SS members were no longer living on the margins. Most had jobs, families, and a place in society. But their reintegration came at a cost, a collective silence about the darker aspects of their past. Germany, rebuilding rapidly, preferred not to look backward. The decade became known as the years of forgetting. But history has a long memory, and by the 1960s and 70s, the silence would be shattered. By the 1960s, a new generation of Germans had grown up, a generation not shaped by Nazi propaganda or wartime trauma. They asked questions their parents refused to answer. They demanded accountability, transparency, and historical truth. This created the first major confrontation between Germany's past and its post-war identity. University protests, investigative journalism, and newly accessible archives began to expose uncomfortable truths. The role of the Waffen-SS in war crimes, anti-partisan terror, and genocide became clearer. Historians dismantled the clean combat force myth that Hayek had worked so hard to establish. Public sentiment shifted dramatically. Hayek's influence began to crumble. Their memoirs were re-examined and criticized for distortions and omissions. Television documentaries unveiled the realities of SS operations. Survivors of Nazi brutality began sharing their stories publicly. The moral landscape had changed. The Waffen-SS was no longer viewed as misunderstood frontline fighters, but as a central pillar of a criminal regime. By the 1980s, Hayek was politically toxic. The German government distanced itself. Major political parties refused their support, and public demonstrations against SS memorial gatherings grew. In 1992, Hayek officially dissolved, overwhelmed by legal pressure, public condemnation, and the deaths of its aging membership. But the story didn't end there. Across Eastern Europe, former members of foreign Waffen-SS divisions, Latvians, Ukrainians, Estonians, Bosniaks, experienced a different historical trajectory. Under Soviet rule, they were condemned as collaborators. After the Cold War, however, some were reinterpreted by segments of their national populations as anti-Soviet fighters. This sparked intense debates, accusations, and counter-accusations that continue to this day. The legacy of the Waffen-SS also re-emerged in unexpected places. Extremist groups around the world appropriated SS symbols, twisting them into modern propaganda. Germany responded with strict laws banning SS insignia and prosecuting Holocaust denial. Education reforms ensured new generations would understand the historical truth. By the 2000s and 2010s, the last surviving Waffen-SS veterans were in their 80s and 90s. Many granted interviews, often attempting to justify their service while avoiding responsibility for atrocities. Some expressed regret, others clung to old narratives. Their testimonies became valuable historical sources, not because they were objective, but because they reflected the mindset of the era. Today, almost none of them remain alive. Their passing marks the end of a human chapter, but not the end of the historical one. The Waffen-SS continues to symbolize the dangerous fusion of ideology, militarism, and fanatic loyalty. Their post-war story of denial, reintegration, myth-making, and eventual exposure serves as a warning about how societies remember, reinterpret, or attempt to bury their past. The shadows of the Waffen-SS are long, and understanding them is essential to understanding the 20th century itself.